So, just last year, CityEngine was used by the City of Hawaii to win the Transit-Oriented Development Project. The County of Honolulu had a challenge which was to add an additional 100,000 people to its population between now and 2040. They knew this would heavily impact existing traffic problems and wanted to find a way to increase their population without further creating suburban sprawl. The concept was to propose a light rail system that connects the east and west sides of the town at these 21 stations. And we worked with the city to show them how the city could look with or without density around these stations. And so we basically generated an analysis around the several transit stations. And these were for walkable areas in green and bikeable areas in orange and red based on distance using Model Builder. And from these we extract out the distance that people typically walk. And we could actually analyze that and see what kind of urban forms fell inside those areas and estimate how much housing we could add in those locations. We came to the conclusion that we can add 80% of Honolulu's housing demand, and that could be added within these areas. The city then wanted to understand what this would look like if we actually developed it. Honolulu had some existing data such as building footprints for the south side of the island, and some 3D models. They wanted to build a 3D city very rapidly that they could conduct alternative futures analysis with. The first thing we did was to bring in existing 3D city models such as SketchUp, Object, Collada, and other formats, and in this case they were mainly OpenFlight files. There we textured models for some of the iconic buildings, but for most of the buildings they just had simple massings. We worked with them to create a library of textures and used procedural rules in CityEngine to apply these textures to the outside of the buildings on the building zoning types, as you see here. And it's going to be applied to the sides of the buildings. Then with their building footprints, we were able to take height information from LiDAR data and apply it back to the building footprints. And based on the zoning type, the buildings were able to apply geotypical textures in specific roof form and use this to very rapidly generate a 3D representation of the whole South Island of Oahu. You'll see these generating in the background. So this process allowed for a 3D representation of the city to be created without having to do the manual process of building 3D models one at a time, building by building, which is extremely time-consuming. It gave them a representation of the existing conditions that could be used to conduct alternative futures with. So here's the light rail system that they're proposing that we were able to procedurally generate in 3D so that they could assess alternative futures against the existing conditions of the urban city core. So remember, we also conducted that walkability analysis around each station. What we could then do is to take the walkability analysis and bring it into CityEngine to determine where we need to add density. They were already working with contractors to do this kind of planning around these stations. So one of the contractors produced these massing models, and we already had a rule that could be applied to these buildings with appropriate textures based on zoning types. So we were able to use this rule to put textures on the buildings to give the city a more realistic representation of what this added density might look like. And most of the contractors were not providing massing models, but zoning change plans or other 2D representations for other areas of the site. We have a procedural rule that can generate buildable volumes based on the regulation, basically the maximal buildable area, and then fill those with representative buildings that do not fill the entire zoning volume, but come close to show the city what the 2D plan might look like if it was built out around that station. But remember, we have that library of textures, so right now it's colored thematically, beige for single-family home, orange for medium-density housing, etc. We can flip that and get more realistic textures and get more realistic buildings on the fly.